in the past, my focus was mainly on the economic side of things. But that was always in the context of basically how the world works, which is run by the imperialist powers. So the politics was never far from that. But obviously, with events of recent years, it makes a lot more sense to give a direct focus on the more political dimensions of what's going on. So that's what I'm doing.
Nice to meet you and nice to have you on this podcast. And whenever you're ready, let's get started.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Tony, we had this Antony Blinken's visit to China in which he was trying to convince Chinese not to help Russia in the conflict in Ukraine. And what Antony Blinken said right after this visit, he said, if Chinese not helping us or not stop helping Russia, we are gonna sanction them, putting more sanction on China. In your opinion, when you look at this conflict in Ukraine, we know that when this conflict started, the United States together with European countries, they all of them put tremendous sanctions on Russia. And with keeping that in mind, do you think what they would do to deal with China, and what's the main goal when it comes to China right now?
Well, they would certainly like to break the links between China and Russia. What they, of course, ignore, because they live in their own bubble, is how all of their actions have driven China and Russia much closer together. And that's shown up in all kinds of ways, all sorts of large policy statements from both China and Russia, pretty much having a similar point of view on the way the world should work. Lots of cooperation in the BRICS setup, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and greatly increasing trade between the two countries. And clearly, China is no idiot, and Russia certainly isn't, to think that the US or the West would leave them alone if they, obeyed those orders. It's more a case of how can we try and isolate Russia and attack Russia, and then China is next. And that's a pretty evident agenda that they have. So it's bound to fail. I think the only issue which comes out is that in the last few years, especially, even before actually the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, Russia have been giving a far more overt political program to oppose the Western domination of more or less everything everywhere. And China was far more in the background, really, not, how can I put it? Not kind of bringing to the fore differences and where they stood. Essentially, they wanted more time, and probably still want more time, to develop their own economy, and that's the key issue. But what we've seen, and again, these are things that probably the Western political leaders don't even read. That China's had long detailed attacks on Western policy, and showing up the hypocrisy and everything else that's been going on in recent years. And what's happened more overtly from China in the past, say, 6 months or so, whereas it had been more obvious with Russia and the statements from Putin and various Russian leaders. But what the Chinese leadership has made it pretty clear they're not going to take this crap anymore, basically. And, you know, they will directly respond far more abruptly with the US than they had really done a couple of years ago. So I think those things have changed, and the overall picture is one where they're basically organizing an alternative world. That's what it boils down to. And in that, they're not, as they both would say, both China and Russia, they both would say, we're not setting up the West as an enemy, but we're going to build a system where, you know, countries can cooperate and treat each other with respect. And that's something which basically means a diminution at the least of Western power, so they don't like it.
You said that China is trying to make their economy, to put it in some sort of independence. How do you see this process? Have they already started this process of getting independent?
Well, it's happening already. Couple of aspects to this. One is that there is far more use of, say, China's currency in its mutual trade with other countries. Back in 2010, the US dollar dominated more than 80% of all China's transactions. All Chinese banks, you know, if they're buying and selling currency from the point of view of trade or investment or anything, more than 80% of their transactions were based on US dollars. That 80% has now dropped to 43%. Still a lot, but far, far less. And the Chinese renminbi, which was, you know, next to nothing back in 2010, only a couple of percent, is now 53%. So that's just one, if you like, quantitative indication of what's going on. And similarly with trade, it's true that, say, Western Europe and the US are important markets for China. You know, it'd be silly to deny that. But the percentage has been decreasing fairly steadily in recent years. In a way, you would expect that if you have a load of sanctions, then you're going to be exporting, importing less. But there's been a build-up of Chinese trade with Latin America, Africa, Russia, and the rest of Asia, and a diminution of the percentage of trade with the EU, the UK, and the US. And this shifting balance has also had an impact on, say, other countries like, say, Taiwan and Korea, where you know, if you're part of the kind of you know, if you're tied to the US by all the military and sanction deals, then you're going to suffer too. And same with Japan, really. So there's been a shift in direct financing with using local currencies, Chinese renminbi, even the ruble, rather than always using the dollar. And that's quite a difficult thing to do because in Asia, the dollar is very dominant. You know, and even in China, you've got the Hong Kong dollar is pegged to the US dollar. So it's going to be very difficult for them to say, well, you know, we'll get rid of it overnight. But it's going to be a progressive development. And on the trade side, it almost happens automatically and pushed even further than maybe they would like, that there's more trade relationships developing with what used to be called the third world, or poorer countries, or basically countries outside the Western system. And, you know, as is clear, China has many excellent relations in among different African countries with many investment projects, you know, telecoms, roads, and infrastructure, power plants, everything like this. And yeah, it's just basically developing in a way. It's kind of funny the way that usual kind of global economic statistics are released and counted tends to miss out quite a lot of these things. So, for example, even if you take, say, on currency, many people would cite the SWIFT data, which is based in Belgium and is the biggest messaging system for bank transactions. So it's definitely the biggest one in the world. But on the SWIFT data, it would look like the Chinese renminbi is nowhere. It's just a couple of percent of the total, few percent. But the fact is that China's got its own messaging system. Russia has its own messaging system for these transactions, and they're busy developing independent ones in India and in other countries to get around SWIFT, because they know full well that, you too could be on the chopping block anytime you step out of the rules that the West has imposed. So there's a whole bunch of these things which are not counted properly in these global surveys, but are going on and are definitely developing and becoming much bigger.
When you look at Russia and how the West put sanction on Russia, and the West, when I'm talking about the West, I'm talking about the European Union and the United States especially, and we saw that how these sanctions backfired on European Union, especially European Union mostly, and because the United States is not that much affected by these sanctions on Russia. Here comes the question: when it comes to China, it seems that it would be much more consequential for Europe if they go to that, to something like what they did to Russia. And do you think that Europe is ready to burden such a pressure?
Short answer is no in practice, but what they will do and what they have done is all kinds of one-dimensional things, which a mixture of political provocation and just, being foolish, essentially. So, they pretty much joined in the TikTok banning or restrictions. They joined in the anti-Huawei mobile phones and telecom systems, and they've paid for it already with that. They're having to use far more expensive European systems instead. What you find in practice, but it may not be decisive, is that all European businesses want to do more business with China. And, you even have recently, the benighted Chancellor Scholz taking a plane load of German executives to China. And the big auto companies in Germany have got many deals with China to expand there and do technological cooperation, all these kind of things. So the economic links are beneficial to both sides for sure. It then comes down to how far they will burn their economic bridges in order to do what they think will save them in terms of economic status and control in the world. For the US, they think they can do it, although even the US, I think, would have great difficulty. And what we've found, for example, is that a lot of Chinese goods go via Mexico into the US rather than directly from China into the US because of the sanctions and everything. In Europe's case, it would be extremely difficult to pull anything like that off. But even if it's economically a really stupid thing to do, frankly, you can't rule it out. in the same way that Europe cutting itself off from Russian energy was economically really stupid. But the way they saw it was that it was far more important as a sign of political unity against a challenger to the Western system or the Western rules that have been laid down, what they're allowed to do, what they're not allowed to do. So they could do stupid things despite the fact that it's economically ridiculous and would be damaging. But, there will be business constituencies that would protest. Maybe it would have an impact. But that makes it quite difficult. One maybe an example pretty much at a tangent, but if you look, say, before the First World War, there were very, very strong business links between Britain and Germany. And British business didn't want a war, just ridiculous. They had lots of trade with Germany, etc., etc. But when the war was declared, they moved almost like a planned economy to cut links with Germany and basically time with the war effort. And that's what European businesses would do as well. And their responses now depend upon where they stand, their particular business, what kind of link it has with China, how much they will be damaged, that kind of thing, so that conditions their response at the moment. So you have, for example, Elon Musk of Tesla goes over to China, does a cooperation deal with Baidu on kind of, getting artificial intelligence working properly for, self-driving cars, that kind of thing. So there's all these things going on, but that doesn't stop an overall move. If suddenly the US Congress comes down and says China is an existential threat to the American way of life or something like this, then I'm sorry, Elon Musk is going to have to shut up, basically. And it will, it will shut up. And so as I say, you can't rule out them doing something economically stupid, because what's at stake is the power relationship. And that's really what drives everything, or what puts limits on what the economic relationships can be.
When it comes to this conflict between the United States and Russia and China, the big question would be how Europe can be a third power, be a powerhouse, just separately, just independent from the United States or China and Russia. And they play a role in this game of powers. But it doesn't seem that Europe is willing to do anything in that direction. We saw that how this war in Ukraine is devastating Germany's economy. And in your opinion, why we don't see a powerful Europe?
Well, they've been caught between the two giants of the US and China for a number of years. I noticed it especially with technology. I remember going to a conference about 5 or 6 years ago when it was a European Commission sponsored conference, and they were talking about the importance of new technology, what can be done, and all this kind of stuff. And you could see the fear in European officials' eyes about the fact that you had, say, the big tech companies of the US, anything from Amazon to Google and Apple and et cetera, and what they could see on the Chinese side was a real build-up there. You had, companies like Tencent and Alibaba and the growth of more domestic technology things. And Europe had next to nothing. I think they had like Spotify or something like that. And even today, they've only got, they do have companies. It'd be silly to say they've got no leading technological companies. There's ASML in the Netherlands, which makes the extreme ultraviolet machines for making tiny semiconductors. But they've allowed even ASML to screw up its own market by, banning exports to China. So essentially, European policy, I wouldn't entirely say they're slaves to the US. It's more that it's almost like they're buddies of the big bully, and the big bully maintains the system that they benefit from. So they want to keep that system in place in order to make sure that the various privileges that they have in the world economy are not taken away or threatened. So that's kind of why they do it, even though, as I say, economically, it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense what they're doing. And they're in a weak position as well. The economy has been pretty stagnant for a number of years. They've got growing problems of deficits and everything else. And so they're now facing, and politically, they're facing a problem of this is the irony of the whole thing. You would think all of these crises would be perfect opportunity for some radical left-wing movement to get going or something like this. But no, what's happened in Europe is that, reactionary right-wing forces have come to the fore instead. They're the only ones challenging this, kowtowing to US demands, but basically. So Europe politically and economically is in a big mess, and I don't think it's easily fixable. Relationships with Russia are pretty much destroyed. Maybe not forever, you can never say forever, but for the foreseeable future, next number of years. And Russia will not easily forgive, won't forgive, and the war's not even over yet. It won't forgive all the kind of deception, double dealing, and everything else that's been going on in recent years. Everything from the Minsk agreements from 2014 up to 2022, and obviously with the war since. So Russia and Europe is pretty much dead. And you can see what a change that is, because I looked about a year ago now, and this is just some data that not many people know, but Russia's foreign exchange reserves, they used to have a big chunk in dollars, say about 15 years ago. Then over time, they reduced the amount of dollars and slightly increased, and it got more in renminbi, Chinese renminbi, and they bought some more gold as well. Not a great deal, but a bit more. And what they did, because they needed the global currency, if you like, so if they couldn't have dollars, they needed something else. And they thought that there was a decent relationship with Europe, with the oil and gas flows, energy pipelines, all this kind of stuff. So what they did was they put a third of their foreign exchange reserves into the euro. And, that looked good to move away from dollars, and the dollars they left at about 10 or 11%. So the biggest chunk of their foreign exchange reserves are in euros. And I think that shocked them. Then when the sanctions came on, after the February invasion in 2022, that, getting on for $300 billion well, it's about 200 roughly in euros. So about $200 billion plus the rest that was jammed up by the Europeans. So they, as I say, that Europe has burned more or less all the bridges that there are between it and Russia must be seething and really angry with the Europeans. So I can't see that relationship ever really building again, even not that much, even on a pragmatic level of, you need grain, you need fertilizer, you need energy. Well, here you are, pay us the money. Because they're still trying not to pay in rubles, for example, and want to pay in euros or dollars or something like this. And instead, what Russia has done is to greatly expand its markets elsewhere. It had some damage for a while, but not that long. And it expanded oil and gas supply into China and also into India. So a great deal of Russian crude oil is being refined by China and India and then sent to Europe. So these morons are now paying much more for it after it's been transformed from the crude position into that, or they're buying Russian gas not through the pipeline, but they're buying Russian liquefied natural gas at a premium. Because of their sanctions and allowing the US to blow up Nord Stream. So, yeah, you've got all of these ridiculous things going on, but as I say, it's completely destroyed any Russia-Europe relationship. And instead, in the last couple of years, what's happened is that Russia has definitely moved to having more of a Eurasian point of view, moving over to the West, the Middle East, and Africa as well. So, yeah, it's basically the changes we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years have been, an accelerated move. Something that ordinarily in the so-called natural cycle would have taken 20, 30 years to develop, but it happened in 2 or 3 years because of all the political pressures from the West on Russia and also on China. And the problem that they have, the West, by which I mean, US, UK, and the key European powers, and Japan's just a hanger-on in all this. The problem that they have is that the resources that both Russia and China have got, all kinds of raw materials, all kinds of technological developments as well. They don't have all the technology they need, but they've got most of it, and they're developing the bits they don't have. So you've got this kind of material base, and then on top of that, you've got a clear political outlook, which is very different from the one that they've tried to impose on the rest of the world. So that's why you have something like 30 or 40 countries who are looking to join BRICS now. And that's a system which, it won't be easy to set up any kind of formal link. I mean, the BRICS countries, it's not a political military bloc. It doesn't pretend to be one. But from the point of view of having a cooperation system outside of Western domination, that's something which, could develop in all kinds of ways. So, yeah. So we're basically seeing, many people have commented on this, it's hardly an original point, but we're basically seeing an erosion of Western dominance worldwide, essentially. And the West has brought on quite a lot of this themselves.
Let's assume that tomorrow this conflict in Ukraine ends and the European Union decides to normalize everything with Russia.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that it would be the same as before this conflict started? Because we know that many of those European companies in Russia have been replaced by Chinese ones.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you see this new, if they start again to have some economic relations between the European Union and Russia, do you think Russia would import the European technology again, or they're just done with that?
There will be economic relations. It's hard to cut them off 100%, even if you absolutely wanted to, and there are all kinds of backdoor ways of doing deals to get what you want. So there will be economic relations, but I think it's hard to see anything going back to like it was before. Because the way it was before was discounted Russian energy fueling, especially Germany, but fueling a number of European countries. And generally speaking, Russia being on the back foot, having to accept all kinds of conditions and everything else. And that's going to be far less the case. I mean, they've had to get alternative markets, Russia has had to do discounts in order to sell much more in a short space of time into, say, India and China. But basically, when you look at the Russian budget, its revenues are pretty strong, and its budget deficit is only about 2%, less than most Western countries, and that's despite a big increase in war spending. So the Russian economy is doing fine and going to grow faster than all those guys as well. And so they would have actually less need than they used to see, because before and for a long time, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they more or less thought, that we're useless, we can't do anything, or that sort of thing. We need to get help from the West, need to do what they say. That's the only way to develop economically. Well, that option didn't work, because, the way the West operates is they don't develop other economies, they screw them up and exploit them. And now Russia's learned that lesson. And again, it will do individual deals where it seems to make sense. There won't be 100% prejudice, a complete block, but they won't trust any of these guys. And, maybe if and when the current generation get voted out or get replaced, of political leaders in Europe, maybe it's a bit different. But it's kind of hard to see that. I think that it's probably worse for, say, the UK, where I'm from, because they're so rabidly anti-Russian, rabidly anti-Chinese as well, for that matter, more recently. For the Europeans, they've had a more pragmatic relationship, at least in business terms. So some of that could come through still. But overall, politically, they're going to be in a very weak position to do much that the Russians will trust. If they can allow Nord Stream, a major multi-year, multi-billion investment project, to be blown to pieces by the US, why would you trust them to build anything, any relationship? So again, it would be pragmatic things here and there, one-off deals, that kind of thing, but it won't be anything like we had before. And that will be to Europe's disadvantage. And, for the US, I really don't know how they can climb out of this big hole they've dug for themselves, actually. So they're continuing to dig and continuing to provoke conflict and wars all over the place, So I think that that's just gonna continue. And you say, let's assume the war in Ukraine is over, but number one, it isn't, and number two, the over bit of it will be a defeat of NATO and Western power in Europe, or it will be a big problem. It already is a very big problem, but it'd be even bigger when there's a settlement of some kind, which I strongly believe will be more or less unconditional surrender by Ukraine, and more or less Russia gets what it wants. And there won't be anything they can do about it. Militarily, they're in no position to step up, send troops in, or do much to even increase, the ammunition or whatever they're sending to Ukraine. They've been such a mess even trying to do that. So I think they're in no position really to fight back in the near term. And longer term, if they want to, well, they probably could get their act together in a few years' time. And all of these think tanks, from the Rand Corporation to, all kinds of other sort of think tanks are all doing these forward planning things, what we need to do. And the problem they have is that they're in the huge mess with Ukraine and Europe. And at the same time, they're trying to kind of plan strategies against China around Taiwan and the general Asian situation. And there they've got even bigger trouble, basically, And all of the US military bases around China, yes, there'll be a problem, but the idea of the US attacking China militarily, I think, is certainly for the next couple of years is a bit far-fetched. But again, when it comes down to these powers thinking that, unless we do something, we're going to be relegated to also rands, and nobody will take us seriously anymore. And usually, we're in charge of the IMF, we're in charge of the World Bank, we fix the United Nations votes, we run the OECD, we run the Bank for International Settlements, we do this, we do that, we do that. We're in charge of all these things, basically. So if an alternative system is built instead, they see all of their treasures effectively evaporating before their eyes. So that means there could be a world war, frankly, obviously we hope there won't be one, because somebody said if there's World War III, then World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones, because that's all we'll have left to fight with. But it's a major crisis, and I would be more optimistic, if you like, about the West, so to speak, if there are any real signs of a decent political opposition movement that had some clout, but there isn't, and there's very little. I mean, in the US or Western Europe, there's all kind of people who don't like what's going on, but often they've adapted to the reactionary sentiment around them, whether it be China or Russia or whatever else. And even over Gaza and what Israel is doing in Gaza, this probably a bit of a shock to some of them. It's been bloody obvious to everybody else for a very long time what Israel gets up to. But so you've got opposition now and people not liking it, but that's because there's a genocide going on right in front of your eyes. But actually, what are you going to do about it? Apart from demonstrations or something, and to call for divestment, yeah, good idea. I'd go along with that. But, back in, again, don't really want to go back to the First World War, but, there were actually, dock workers preventing arms being sent to fight the Bolsheviks in Russia. So they're actually doing something to stop it, not, just having a big demo and complaining and things like this. I say I don't want to cast any aspersions on the students. They're, taking a lot of personal risk actually in what they're doing. But things need to go far beyond that over this issue. And it's questionable whether they will. And so, from the point of view of getting any justice in the world, if there can't be justice for Palestine when you've got all this crap going on in front of your eyes, the other bits of justice for all kinds of other countries and peoples around the world, where's that going to come from? Basically. So, I would see the Palestine issue as being really a kind of a litmus test for quite a lot of political developments today to indicate where somebody really stands regarding imperialism and their understanding of how the world works, basically. So I would like to think that Russia and China would, do something about that. I think it's pushing it a bit, and it doesn't look as if there's much going on in that direction. And, frankly, they've got a lot on their plate anyway, with all the other things going on. But I think the major project which is in place to build an alternative world system outside of the control of Western powers, that's a fundamental major issue. Won't have seen anything like that being done for, however many decades you want to put forward, really.
In your opinion, when it comes to the conflict in Russia, I want to talk about Gaza and what's going on in Gaza. But before going to that topic, let's talk about the situation in Ukraine right now. Russia we know that Russia, when they started this special military operation in Ukraine, they didn't want to take the western part of Ukraine. And so far, we've seen that they have no desire to get the western part of Ukraine, to conquer the western part of Ukraine. And it seems that in the eyes of Russians, the war is already done, and they don't need to go further to achieve anything more. And on the other hand, we see that in the West, because they start talking about negotiations. For a long time, they're talking about, we are ready to negotiate with the West, the Ukrainians. But you see no desire in the West to talk, to go after some sort of negotiations, to go after some sort of political settlement. And right now, in your opinion, we know that this war in Ukraine has been lost long time ago. And but they trying to send more ammunition, more weapons, more money to keep this house of cards working in Ukraine. Do you think when would be that moment that Europe, together with the United States, says, no, this conflict is done in Ukraine. Let's go and find some sort of political settlement for this conflict? Or we have to wait until the 2024 presidential election in the United States is over? Or do we have to wait to this battle between Republicans and Democrats getting over and see who's going to be the next president of the United States, and what would be his policy or her policy in the conflict in Ukraine? How do you see this concept of this conflict in Ukraine right now?
Well, Russia's definitely winning. The whole process is much slower than I thought it would be, frankly. And that's partly because it was a special military operation, not a war. So, and also they consider Ukrainians as brothers, not, some foreign entity we have to destroy. So that's why civilian casualties have been minimal, basically. And most of them seem to be caused by, Ukraine's air defense missiles hitting buildings, that kind of thing. I think, though, that it's not over for Russia's aims by quite some way. I think from the point of view of security, which is what it boiled down to right from the beginning, they would need to take the whole Black Sea coast of Ukraine, which means Odessa. If they didn't take Odessa, they would have this kind of quasi-NATO base, forever trying to screw them up in Crimea and elsewhere. So I think that needs to happen. How soon? Who knows? Maybe by the end of the year, but maybe that's a bit soon. But essentially, it is true what you say, that they had no real intention of, taking over the whole of Ukraine. That was never the intention. But the problem is, how can you have, you can rescue the more, if you like, Russian-orientated populations in the east and the south. But what can you then do about a bunch of, rabid fascists who are anti-Russian, who are then being fed with Western weapons in the west of Ukraine? So that's a political issue they have to sort out. And I think at a minimum, it will be, an imposition of no military whatsoever in that part of Ukraine. People have speculated upon having some kind of buffer zone or something like this, maybe along those lines. But the longer this goes on, the less of what's left of Ukraine will be. And the economy is a wreck anyway. Complete disaster. Most of the agricultural land got sold off to Western asset managers, and it's a complete basket case, and they mainly surviving for a whole number of years on the back of what was taken from the Soviet Union, effectively. And there could have been cooperation deals, and there were initially, up until 2014 at least. But all of that's out the window. So I think there'll be next to nothing left of Ukraine. What is left will not be allowed to be a political military threat to Russia. So all that, of course, that's some way down the line. That won't be in the next few months. That prospect is such a major political military defeat for NATO, the West, etc., that I don't see how they can climb down from that. They're going to have to, because that's, if you like, a minimum condition that Russia will put forward. And the Europeans, I'd more or less forget about them. They play no role. The Americans do, and the Brits in on that as well. But the most you get is that, Trump's fantasy of sorting it all out in a couple of days, something like this. And yeah, in principle, they may try and put forward some kind of deal, but I don't see why Russia should trust any of it. All the documents that have come out have shown what they've been doing in Ukraine for the last more than 10 years, basically. And all the history going back, I've looked at a lot of this, shows that, MI6, the secret intelligence service for the foreign countries in Britain, they were doing this from the 1930s, using Ukraine against Russia, or against, the Soviet Union, as then was. So you know, I don't see there's any basis for any trust in whatever the West comes up with, and they're going to be faced with a demand for unconditional surrender. And I don't think there's anything they can do about it, you know. So, you know, however much destruction goes on is however much destruction goes on. You know, it's a complete, you know, catastrophe, really. But that's what that decision brought them, basically. Yeah, and it looks like, if anything, you know, who knows what's in Joe Biden's senile mind, but it looks like, you know, they want to string it along at least until November, when he hopes that it won't be too embarrassing before then. And in the meantime, he's got Gaza to deal with, of course, um, but the American policy, whether it's Biden or Trump or anybody, is going to be seriously shaken by the failure of NATO and just the failure of American weapons, as we, you know, seeing in Moscow today. They've got a number of them on show in a parade, in a May Day parade. Yeah, so it's hard to see how they can climb out of this huge hole they've dug for themselves politically, but they're going to have to, or there's going to be a world war, frankly. That's it, you know.
In the aftermath of the Soviet Union, we had Yeltsin, and right after Yeltsin, we had Putin in power. And it seems that in the West, as much as they love Yeltsin, they hate Putin. And you know, you see, in your opinion, what was the reason behind this hatred toward Putin? We saw this in this conflict in Ukraine. Before this conflict started, in the mainstream media in the West, they're talking, and Putin is a new Hitler. And when you look at Putin's behavior during all these years, you see nothing like being a Hitler, because Hitler was a racist. And everybody knows what he did. And Putin just came and unified Russia. We have various ethnicities in Russia: Muslims, we have Jews, we have Christians, all together. And what Putin did in Russia is just unifying Russia, just making Russia united. But it seems that in the eyes of the West, that was not good for them. What's the reason behind that, in your opinion?
It's basically that having a drunk idiot like Yeltsin in charge was brilliant for them, because that meant that you know, all kinds of Russian assets got sold off cheaply. They had all kinds of deals that they could use, and it's been a long-standing thing more in US than in European political circles about breaking up Russia, you know, dividing it into 5 or 6 different countries, you know. And the reason they hate Putin is simply that he wasn't a drunken idiot, and he wanted to stand up for the country, basically. So that's what he did. He's a Russian nationalist, you know. No way he's a communist, socialist, or anything of the kind, you know. He basically pulled the economy and society out of a big hole, you know, in the early 1990s that it had been in. And Russians have seen their living standards rise pretty sharply. You know, they're not rich people, but, you know, risen dramatically. And things have gotten markedly better, basically. That's why he has very solid popular support. So that's why they have to come up with, you know, characters like Navalny, who never had any support, really, or a couple of percent. You know, it's just ridiculous to pretend that someone like Navalny had any popular support as the big dissident. And so what has happened, it's been a learning process for Putin as well, because initially, well, firstly, even talking about joining NATO, wanting to join the EU, doing all kinds of deals and everything, because he wanted to get the economy to develop and saw that the mess that had gone on before couldn't continue. But all of those efforts were basically pushed to one side by all the Western countries. And he only really put his foot down in 2008, I think it was, 07 or 08. There's a Munich Security Conference where he did a long speech. And as in all of his long speeches, none of the Western politicians listened to it or pay any attention to it. And they probably didn't read it either. But that made very clear that we're not going to put up with this crap. And we will not accept, Georgia and Ukraine going into NATO. And, we do not accept all of these rules that you're putting down. And we want to be treated with respect. Essentially, that was largely the context of it. And since then, everything he's done has been to build up different aspects of Russia's economy, its military, its international links. And the links, for example, they had a conference some months ago, I think now, of Russia-Africa links, and about more than 50 African countries came to it. And they're very strong links, because many people around the world saw Russia's anti-colonial position, or the Soviet Union's anti-colonial position, and there's a lot of benefits they get from that. And, people don't think, they're here to rip us off, which is generally what they do think with justification whenever US or European politicians come along and give them lectures. So the reason they hate Putin, the reason he's this big Hitler, in their view, is simply that he's standing up to Western power. And it was only done marginally before, and only developed further when he had no choice. The Minsk agreements from 2014, he was going along with them, basically, and do some deal, keep the Russian language as an option in the country, have some independence for the Donbass region, etc. All of this pretty easygoing stuff, frankly. And it didn't do much to oppose the growing war that the Kiev regime had launched on Donbass. Didn't really do much about it. There were bits here and there, and I think the Wagner group got going in there, and they no doubt gave them some arms, but not that much. So all of this has been quite a big learning process. And you could almost say that despite himself, Putin has become anti-imperialist. He wasn't planning to be, he just wanted to be a Russian nationalist, develop the economy and, keep the country together. But he's had to become an anti-imperialist because all these people trying to cut them to pieces. And I think that's what's happened, and it's not the traditional kind of, Che Guevara anti-imperialist or anything like this. But basically that's what's happened. And as I say, he's got very strong positions, and I think there's enough people around him too that he's getting on a bit now. I can't remember exactly how old, but he won't be around forever. But there's enough of a political elite in Russia who are sensible enough to, I think, manage this through. And because they've done a good job of building up all these relationships on the basis of trust with all kinds of different countries, have a relationship with Saudi Arabia, right? We're not going to interfere in what you're doing in Saudi Arabia, and you and me and many other people would say, bloody Saudis, what they do and what they get up to. But, no, it's a non-interference approach that Russia does and also China does. And that's appreciated by lots of countries who are used to being bullied. So it pays off, frankly, But I think the anti-Putin stuff will continue, more or less has to. But it will look more and more ridiculous. But who have they got? Can you name one single European politician who's not a complete moron or a lackey of US foreign policy? It's a joke.
You see, when you talk about Africa, it seems that we are witnessing a huge change coming to Africa right now, because we had the government in Niger and asking American troops to asking the United States to withdraw the American troops from Niger. Right now in Chad and other countries in Africa, they started just asking the West to leave them alone. And on the other hand, you see this new relationship between Russia and African countries, between African countries and China. And how do you see in that continent what's going on in Africa, in your opinion?
There are a lot of dimensions to this, because the overriding objective of most African leaders, and in particular the more independent ones now in Burkina Faso, Niger, and what's the other country now? I've forgotten. But that group in the Sahel and a number of others, they want economic development. So they're happy to do deals with China. They see that they pay off. They get roads, telecom systems, power plants, everything else. And I think Russia is doing some things like oil refineries and things like this in a couple of those countries too. So those things are going on. It doesn't make sense either for the African countries to say to the West, get lost. In a way they can't. Many of them were dominated by the French, who had, I think more than 20 countries have been French colonies, especially in the northern area of the region. But so kind of, you can't turn your back on that all at one go. But if you've got I would say this even kind of pragmatically, that say you disliked and distrusted Russia, you disliked and distrusted China. Well, the thing is, you don't just have now the IMF knocking on your door, or the French or the British or the Americans then making some proposal that you more or less have to accept. You can say, no, actually, I've got a better deal with Russia and a better deal with China, so goodbye, on this particular issue. So each of them are in a much better bargaining position to get what they want for their own country. And it was notable with the leader of Burkina Faso when he had a direct one-to-one interview with Putin a few months ago, and was basically, asking, we're very much interested in getting projects for economic development. That was it. It wasn't like, any great ideological thing, just basic ABC stuff. And Africa could develop dramatically. And the problem up to now has been that, saying the transport system is always a transport from the plantation or the mine to the port, and then it goes off to Europe and America. So even kind of cross-country transport is not that great. China has done a lot to fix that with railway systems, roads and everything. And, you know, they can do it themselves, and, you know, all kind of other things could happen. But it's going to be a long process. But now there is a chance for them to have a choice in what they want to do, and not be bullied, essentially. And so, as I say, you know, you could be as cynical as you like about Russia, China, or whatever, but at an absolute minimum, they're giving an alternative option rather than the single option of the IMF, the World Bank, or the European Commission coming along and saying, you know, you'll do this. And so I think that, you know, in that respect, things are going to be very good for them. And especially if, as looks to be the case, actually, that, you know, rather than having just, say, a mine or a plantation that, you know, produces the grain or produces the raw materials, and the raw stuff gets sent off, and then all the premium for refining it and transforming it into the end product, all that goes to Western companies, Western countries. What I think is going to happen now is that many more of these countries are going to do their own local processing and develop their economies in that kind of respect. They have no choice. You know, they really ought to do that, and it should have been done decades ago, but they had no possibility of getting the funding and the assistance to do it. Whereas now they do. So I'd be optimistic about the potential for Africa. It's then a question of the disastrous politics, basically. So just as you've got, you know, a shitty, corrupt regime in Europe, you've got often shitty, corrupt regimes in many African countries, and it's only half a dozen of the newer ones who've broken out of that and have got a clearer notion of what they want to happen and develop their country.
When we look at the conflict in Ukraine, it's so amazing that it wasn't when it started, we didn't know that how this conflict, this war gonna change everything. Since this conflict started, you see that everything is changing in Africa, in the Middle East. As you mentioned, China was in the background. You look at Africa, you look at Middle East, that this deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, that China and Russia, I mean, I believe Russia and China together did that. And you see how the European Union is getting isolated by their own sanctions, and how the world is changing. The rise of BRICS, and we have 6 new members to BRICS, and it's when you look at BRICS right now, you see energy, you see technology, you see everything, you see natural resources, everything is in this combination, in this organization. And how when you look at, do you think that when history comes and decide to see what happened in this conflict in Ukraine, why everything changed in the aftermath of this conflict, do you think, are we gonna say that this was a crucial turning point of everything in the world?
I think so. It's a good marker, put it that way, because it helped to accelerate things dramatically. And I wrote an article on this in September 2022, I think it was. And it's quite a long article, but it kind of goes through. It noted all the raw materials, say, that the original 5 BRICS countries had, plus a number of the extras who were possibly going to join. And then said, okay, you've got the raw materials, what do? Have you got the technology? Well, not entirely, but you've got quite a bit of it. Look at this, look at that, look at that. You know, a lot of China developments in technology, and, you know, obviously weapons technology as well with Russia and China, and all kinds of things that they've done. And then you say, well, okay, you've got the you've got the material, you've got the technology. How do you move it around? Well, okay, we've got a new road system, we've got a new transport system, throughout the whole of Eurasia, and all these kind of connections and everything. And, they were relatively new, but quite a lot of this actually got going about 15 years ago, maybe a bit more, with the Belt and Road Initiative by China. And, to put hundreds of billions of dollars into these projects. And, it's been transformative for many of those countries involved. And they've got, I can't remember an exact number now, but I think it's over 100 countries in the Belt and Road Initiative. The Europeans used to be in it. And then of course, oh no, the evil Chinese, we mustn't do that. There's even deals with France on telecoms and things like this, and then they junked it. So and what China was doing was linking up the Eurasian landmass with the Middle East area, Saudi Arabia, into East Africa, with telecoms, transport lines, all kinds of things, And so when you put all this together, you have all the building blocks for a new world system. But what has accelerated it, indeed, has been the war in Ukraine, because once you started having, you're an evil Russia, you can't be in SWIFT anymore, the bank messaging system, and it's okay, we'll build our own ones, or we'll use our own ones much more where we didn't use them much in previous period, or we'll seize your assets. Okay, I think we better put them somewhere else then. And there was recent news of a number of African and Middle Eastern countries repatriating their gold from the US, just in case they fell foul of, Trump or somebody in the future. And he decided that he wanted to keep hold of their gold, that kind of thing. So there's all of these things, plus many bilateral deals being done in local currencies. And modern technology makes a lot of this much easier than it used to be. That, say, I don't want to talk about Bitcoin, but with Bitcoin, you've got two things, right? You've got an imaginary currency, which is a complete fantasy farce. But then you've got a blockchain system of transferring property titles and information. The blockchain system makes absolute sense and is actually being used now by financial institutions. And it's beginning to be used also by some BRICS countries in terms of setting up a financial system between them. So, forget about the Bitcoin crap, but the technology for communication and transfer, that kind of stuff is in place. So, and again, all of this in the last couple of years, it really has been an astonishing thing. It's frankly, I'm no spring chicken, but this is far and away the biggest political development in my whole life, basically. And okay, I shouldn't cast aspersions on the Vietnam War or anything like this, but basically, that was important, and many things are important. But from the point of view of world politics, where there's a very good chance of progressive developments coming out of it, I think this is a major, major event. And it's not over yet by a long way. And of course, all of these countries that feel threatened by it, obviously the US, but also the Europeans, because they're losing their privileged status, they're going to cause trouble. And the issue then for the the other countries is how they can manage that trouble that these guys are going to try and cause them. But yeah, it's something that really brightens my political outlook, I must say.
Beside these two conflicts in Ukraine and in Taiwan between the United States and China and Russia, we are witnessing this new conflict. It's not a new conflict. It's a pretty old conflict between Gaza and between Palestinians and Israelis. And it seems that in the United States right now, people are so unhappy with the Biden's policy in Gaza. And do you think this conflict, this new escalations in Gaza would bring the Middle Eastern countries even closer, would bring them closer to China and Russia, and that would hugely benefit BRICS if they go that direction, even together with Turkey? We know that Turkey is so important for Israel and for NATO. And how do you see the situation right now in the Middle East?
Well, it's a bit complicated, as they say. The thing is, obviously, well, say even on the US side, it's notable that when you look at opinion polls on Israel and Palestine, it's generally the younger generation up to the age of 30 or something that are more pro-Palestinian. As they survey older people, it becomes more pro-Israeli, much more. And that's true in both Republicans and Democrats. And there's, what's many people characterize it as, Israel is running US policy. Well, no, Israel is the US attack dog, and they want to protect their attack dog, basically. And they were using that using this Zionist state to keep tabs on countries around, make sure things don't get too out of hand in Lebanon, Syria, and Iran as well, for that matter. Well, the problem is that all of the governments, regimes, whatever you want to call them, in the region, the Gulf states, Egypt, most of them in that region, basically, except for Syria, have basically been put in place by the British and the Americans, or they've greatly managed what's going on. Like countries like Jordan are a joke, and similarly, the only thing that's made it a bit questionable, ironically, is with Saudi Arabia, that from the point of view of their economic development, and in many ways it does come down to this. It sounds a bit simplistic and one-dimensional, but it does kind of come down to it. If you think, bin Salman came up with his, I think, Vision 2030 thing about developing Saudi Arabia. And how the hell is he going to do that? The West is not going to help him. So, of course, he does deals with China, lots of cooperation with China, which also actually includes, selling the Chinese oil in terms of Chinese renminbi, not in dollars. So there's that kind of thing that these countries, I think, are going to be under almost kind of, it's almost happening without them being conscious of them doing it, that they have to kind of find other relationships and other ways to develop, because the Western stuff doesn't bloody work, right? With Turkey, I think this is a really tricky problem. Clearly, Turkey's geographical position has greatly conditioned its politics. And you'll know more about this than me, I guess. But so it's a case of it wants to be a go-between between East and West. But but it's backed up, the Islamic terrorists in Syria and in other places around the Middle East, to undermine Assad. And part of NATO has done maybe not stuff regarding Russia and Ukraine, probably supplying weapons through the Black Sea, apart from the Bayraktar drones and other things that it's done. So it kind of playing both sides at the same time, which in a sense, kind of makes sense from their point of view that, why not take every opportunity that there is? But it starts becoming a problem when taking every opportunity there is starts supporting one side against another. And that, I think, is going to be a bigger aspect of what will happen in the coming years. And even, say, Turkey had a decent trade, actually, as China does, with Israel in various products. And, they restricted some of them, but not that many, and it probably wouldn't have that much impact. So it's a case of, well, what do they do? And then there's been a lot of rhetoric from Erdogan, but, what's really going to happen? And even, I remember back with the Mavi Marmara, more than 10 years ago now, I think it was, they went and, attacked and killed loads of people on that Gaza aid boat, and a lot of complaining, but not a great deal happened in terms of freezing relationships and things like this. So it's something where I think Turkey is going to have to make its mind up where it stands. And, actually, a good step would be to leave NATO. That would be, be the real shocker. Because Turkey has already been insulted and rejected from joining the EU. That's never going to happen. The EU will want energy through that energy hub that Russia's got in Turkey. So, even if the EU gets annoyed about it, it's not going to say, well, I'm not going to take any energy, because they're going to need it, basically. So they could be in a stronger economic position, but politically they need to make their minds up what they're doing. And I think that at the moment it's difficult for it will be difficult for other countries to put much trust in what Turkey is doing, thinking that another opportunity will come along and it will do something that stabs them in the back. So that's something which, they're going to have to make their minds up, basically. I hope they do, and I hope they make the right decision. But it will also benefit them, from the whole Eurasia project issue, transport links, economic links, communications, all kinds of things. Be very beneficial for Turkey as well. But they then have to reconsider what they're doing, in a number of countries. I mean, all of the national national border lines that we see, quite a lot of them are artificial. From a European perspective, we're used to things being pretty much staying the same, unless there's a big war and there's something happens. But, they kind of more or less stay the same. And, I think even France would like to pretend that its border's always been there, if forgetting about, what's happened in the past 100 years, But basically, it's meant that many borders in Europe, whether it be around the Baltic area or around southern Russia into Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Armenia, and everything like this, it's a mess, frankly. And, you know, a rational person would say, why don't you cooperate and sort this out? You'll be benefit for everybody. You know, and it seems pretty evident that would be the case, but the politics don't allow it. And so say they're going to have to make their minds up what they're going to do. They're going to just have this ridiculous conflict over nothing. You know, it won't do them. Even if they won the damn conflict, it wouldn't really do them any good. You know, that's almost like the saddest thing about it is, you know, squabbling over something that wouldn't really change much anyway. Whereas why don't they cooperate and build a new system, basically, and then they can benefit. So anyway, there's me being a bit utopian here, but there you go.